number one, most importantly, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you on our online chat. My name is Kerry Sautner. I will be your moderator for today. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. Before we get started, I want everybody to know that we are live streaming this session and we're recording it. So if anybody wants to watch this at a future date, it will be on our website as well as our YouTube page, and we're able to share it with other people. So welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am here with the fantastic CEO and President, Jeff Rosen. Jeff, you want to say hi and welcome?
Hi, everyone, and I'm here with our fantastic Chief Learning Officer, Kerry Sautner, and both of us are so looking forward to talking with you about the First Amendment.
So real quick before we get in that, we are at the National Constitution Center, we're doing a few things to make sure that we teach the Constitution in the most conversing and open dialogue way as possible. So I'm going to show you real quick a little bit about us, and then we are then going to jump into how we're going to do this today. So if you've never been to the Constitution Center, here's a beautiful picture of it, which is not today's picture because it is definitely raining in Philadelphia, even though we kind of think that it's always sunny in Philadelphia. We are a nonprofit, a nonpartisan organization. We opened our doors about 15 years ago, but our job is to not just teach the United States Constitution in Philadelphia, but around the country. And this is one way that we do it. So we want to make sure that you go through the Scholar Chat today and have a lot of fun and ask a lot of questions, but join us online for all of our blogs and our videos and our exchanges as we go through the year. So real quick, one of my favorite places to send you all is the Interactive Constitution. As you guys go through this, if you're second screeners like me and love to have like 5 screens open at the same time, feel free to check out the Interactive Constitution. Jeff is going to be quoting from it and pulling parts of the Constitution and going through it. And as he does that, you can look on those pages as well. But like I said earlier, I promise I will send everybody who registered a cheat sheet of every case that we went through, every web link, and every video. And you can go through these videos at your leisure and watch and see kind of this information again, because we know it's a quick hour and we have a lot to talk about. The First Amendment's huge. We're just doing the speech section, but that's huge as well. And there's a lot of great stories to it. As we go through these, all these pieces will be online. We have a great video with Justice Kagan, and you will love what she talks about with speech as well. And then briefly, I want to go over kind of the educational structure of these conversations and everything we do at the center. Jeff is a great storyteller, so he's going to give you the best historical foundations and give you those stories about the people that wrote the Constitution, the people that have interpreted the Constitution, and we, the people that have brought these cases to the Supreme Court. As we go through those, we're going to pose for you in the chat box and through the discussion big constitutional questions. I'm going to let Jeff talk in a minute about what is a constitutional question compared to a political question, because it really is the focus of today. We're going to ask the constitutional questions around speech. But before we get there, I just want to make sure that our goal and mission as an institution is to have civil dialogues. Now, in this time with Zoom, we're doing it very differently than we were a month ago, but we're still doing it. And we want to make sure we hear your voice and your questions and have a dialogue with you. So as we go through this, again, just make sure that your chat box is open. You can ask questions and answer questions in there. And for constitutional questions that pop into your head, also put them in the Q&A. And what I'll do throughout the program is I'll jump in and ask Jeff some of your constitutional questions from that chat box. So let me turn it over to Jeff and let you get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Kerry. Welcome, everybody. What a thrill it is to be here with you talking about the First Amendment. And before we can say anything about the First Amendment, we've got to read it. It's so important always to begin with the text. And Kerry told you about the Interactive Constitution, which you can get online. I've got it right here in front of me. And let's together read the text of the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment has different clauses, and we're going to be spending the next 2 weeks talking about each of them. But today we're talking about the speech and press clause. So let me just read that. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That's the one we're going to focus on today. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the free exercise clause. Then next week, we'll talk about the establishment clause and the petition and assembly clause. But we're really beginning with the heart of the matter, which is so exciting. All right, so why should we care about the First Amendment? And how is it relevant to your lives? I'm going to pose a series of questions right now, and we're going to take some preliminary votes on them. In other words, I'm going to ask you essentially, can the government do that? That's the question I'm going to ask. And as you take your preliminary polls or votes, I want you to think like a constitutional lawyer. What does that mean? I want you to separate your political from your constitutional views. In other words, my first question, not to hide the ball, is can the government stop someone from burning the American flag to protest the government? That's the question I'm going to ask you. But before you answer that, I want you to separate your political from your constitutional views. In other words, don't ask whether you think it's a good idea for someone to burn the flag in protest of the government, whether that's respectful or whether that's a fair exercise of dissent. But does the First Amendment allow or prohibit it? So you got to go back to those words. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Do you believe that it is an abridgment of freedom of speech for the government to stop someone from burning the flag to protest government policies? That's the first question. All right, Kerry, can you start tabulating the votes, or friends, can you start voting?
Yep. So everybody started voting already. They didn't even let you get the whole question out of here. And as we go through and I scroll through, a lot of it, no way. Symbolic speech is still speech. Again, as always, the 1 o'clock crew is some smart crew. And there was even a few references to the case, the court case on this. So no.
Johnson, there it is.
Yeah, yes. Exactly.
But Ayanna just said, yes, it can be. Yes. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. See, so we've got a nice division of views on this question. Yes, there are some cases. Absolutely. These chats are just coming right in. No, yes. And Robert Morris, there's a great, one of the founders was called Robert Morris. That's a wonderful name. Yes, it is allowed. It's great that all of you are divided on this question, because keep voting as long as it doesn't endanger health or safety. I think that was the end of that point there. That's the central question. And in deciding the case, Texas v. Johnson, which lots of you correctly identified, the Supreme Court divided 5-4 on this question. 5 justices, led by the late Justice Antonin Scalia, said, no, the government may not prevent someone, Gregory Johnson, from standing outside a government building and burning the flag. And that was because, as many of you suggested, the court held that even burning the flag is a form of speech. It's symbolic speech, since he wasn't actually speaking. He was expressing his views through the act of burning the flag. And the court reaffirmed a longstanding doctrine that we're going to talk about that was hard won, that people fought the American Revolution to protect, that was initially rejected by the court, but was resurrected in a series of very dramatic cases. And the basic principle holds that speech in America can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That's the test. It's the express advocacy test. And it's an extraordinarily protective test. It means that the US protects speech more vigorously than almost any other country in the world, intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. A majority of the court held, well, Gregory Johnson was not intending to or likely to cause imminent violence when he stood on the steps of a government building and burnt the flag. He was just expressing his disapproval of government policies, in particular of the war. But there were dissenting opinions. 4 justices dissented. In that case, the dissenter was Justice John Paul Stevens. He had served in World War II. And Justice Stevens believed that the flag was special. To disrespect the flag was an expression of disrespect for the country itself. And the government was allowed to protect the special symbolic sanctity of the flag by prohibiting people from burning it, because people fought a war to protect it. Essentially, the flag was like the Constitution, Justice Stevens suggested, and the Constitution had to be protected. So those were the arguments on both sides.
Yeah, just for a little clarity, Samuel asked, can you help me a little bit understand, because he's a little confused, what does a symbolic speech mean?
Excellent question. Well, speech is what I'm doing now. I'm just talking to you and we're learning about the First Amendment. What would symbolic speech mean? Here I'm going to say, hooray for the Constitution. Let's go, Constitution. I'm so proud of you for learning it. Now I'm going to say the same thing symbolically. And that's supposed to be an encouraging, yes, rah, rah. That would be symbolic. I'm not actually speaking, but I'm making a symbol. I'm raising my arm, not closing my fist in an angry way, but I'm trying to make it invitingly and saying hooray for the Constitution. It's kind of off. We don't actually have a rah, rah gesture. Let me give you a more salient example of symbolic speech. Can I be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance or to salute the flag? There we go. There's symbolic speech. Can I be forced to stand in a classroom and salute the flag or put my hand over my heart and then say the Pledge of Allegiance? The symbolic part would be the salute and the placing of the hand over my heart. The speech, of course, would be saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, let me ask you that. What do you think? Can the government force you or me to put our hands over our hearts or to salute the flag and to say the Pledge of Allegiance? Let's take a poll on that, which the Supreme Court heard as well. No, not at all. Nope. There was a yes. No, 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 nope. You cannot be forced. We're getting a pretty unanimous series of no's there, and that's freedom of expression. No, that's correct. Because the Supreme Court, in a very important case called the Barnett case, West Virginia versus Barnett, held the following. You know what? I can't do full justice to Justice Jackson's words. I could call them up. Let me give you. You know what? They're so beautiful that I'm going to actually read from them because it's the most inspiring thing imaginable. And here we go. Here we go. Listen to what Justice Jackson said. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. Wow, I just get chills every time I read those beautiful words. Justice Jackson was one of the greatest writers in the 20th century on the Supreme Court. His decisions are a form of constitutional poetry. And that was his holding. He said, we think the actions of local authorities in compelling the flag salute and pledge transcend constitutional limitations and invades the sphere of intellect and spirit, which it is the purpose of the First Amendment to the Constitution to reserve from all official control. Isn't that beautiful, friends? The sphere of intellect and spirit. Justice Jackson is saying that there's a zone of mental privacy, a freedom of conscience that the First Amendment was designed to protect. And he was right to do so because at the time of the framing, complete freedom of conscience was considered the quintessential natural right that all of us hold in trust from God or nature, not from government. And now I'm going to tell you a story about the founding. Kerry said that when we talk about every amendment, we've got to go back to the founding and hear about the stories that inspired these provisions. So Kerry, is it okay if I tell that story right now?
Yeah, because I guess one of my questions around that flag was it that always the case? Was that final case that when you just referenced, was that always true? Or were there court cases before that? And that backs me up. I want to go, I love this because we can like time machine it and say, what did the founding generation think about these symbolic speech and direct speech? And why did they think it was so important? And then how did that change over time?
Well, it's a great question, and I can't wait to tell you about it because it's such an exciting story. And it changed so dramatically that it's just a riveting realization of how constitutional understandings can change over time. I mean, just to answer Kerry's question immediately, was it ever differently? Why, the court, just a few years before the Barnett case, in a case called Minnersville School District versus Scobitis, held the opposite and said it was okay for a school to compel the flag salute. And in just a few years, the court changed its mind. So that's how quickly the constitutional understandings changed in just a couple of years. In West Virginia versus Barnett was 1943. But let's go back to the founding. Let's begin at the very beginning. It's always such a great place to begin. And we can even begin not with the Constitution, but with the Declaration of Independence, written in 1776, years before the Constitution was written in 1787. You all know the famous preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What did the founders have in mean when they talked about the unalienable right liberty that came from God or nature, not from government? We're born with it. We're not given it by some petty bureaucrat or government official. Well, the quintessential unalienable rights the founders believed was the rights of conscience, the right to believe whatever my reasoning mind told me to believe. The founders believed that our beliefs, our opinions, are the product of our reason. These are all people of the Enlightenment. They read John Locke, they read philosophers like Francis Hutcheson, but they also read the ancient Greeks. They read Aristotle and Socrates, who believed that our opinions are the product of involuntary sensations presented to our reasoning minds. And I don't have the ability to give Curry the right to command me to believe anything, because I can't compel myself or anyone else to believe what I please. My beliefs are the product of my reason, and my reason is inherent to who I am as a human being. So that's why the rights of conscience, or what Justice Jackson called the rights of intellect and spirit, are so fundamental. All of us, as creatures of reason, must be absolutely free to think whatever our minds tell us to think, to change our opinions after thoughtfully considering other people's opinions in the light of reason. And we cannot, even if we wanted to, surrender to the government or to someone else the power to tell us what to think, because we can't even tell ourselves what to think. It's the product of our reason. Isn't that a beautiful expression of faith in reason? It's just very empowering for all of us, but it's also an obligation as well as a right, because we have a duty to exercise our powers of reason just as we're doing today, and to learn together and to think and to grow. Come, let us reason together, said Justice Louis Brandeis, who we're going to learn about in a second, quoting from the prophet Isaiah. And that's what the founders insisted on, us reasoning together. Okay, so that's the first idea at the time of the framing. Now we're going to get to the Constitution, and soon after it's passed in 1787, there's a big controversy that came to define the meaning of the First Amendment, and it was over a law that was passed in 1798 to prohibit criticism of the government, and it centered around the Alien and Sedition Acts, which Curry just put up here because she is reading my mind, and we're very much in sync here. So here are pictures on the screen of two people, John Adams on my left, which says cannot criticize, and Thomas Jefferson says criticizing okay. John Adams was the head of the Federalist Party. The Federalists are in power, he's the president, and Congress, which is controlled by Federalists, passes a law, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which prohibits criticizing the president, who's a Federalist, but not the vice president, who's a Democratic Republican. Basically, the whole law is designed to protect John Adams from being criticized. And as a result of this law, a bunch of people who criticize John Adams and say he's an aristocrat and a secret monarchist are hauled up for sedition, which means criticizing the government, and they're indicted and convicted. Well, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, write pamphlets called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, essentially claiming that these sedition prosecutions are unconstitutional. Why? Because according to Jefferson and Madison, they violate the unalienable rights of conscience. Government has no right to suppress robust and vigorous criticism of government officials, because citizens must be absolutely free to receive all opinions so that they, exercising their powers of reason, can make up their own minds on matters of public concern. It's a invigorating and inspiring testament to the power of complete and unfettered freedom of debate as being centrally necessary for the exercise of our rights of conscience and for self-government in a democracy. Listen to this interesting connection, friends. The founders see a connection between personal and political self-government. I must master my passion so I can be guided by my reason as an individual. And similarly, we as citizens together must master our passion so we can be guided by reason as citizens of a republic. Personal and political self-government are connected all in this beautiful idea of complete freedom of conscience. So that's the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, then Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and among his first acts, he pardons the people who are convicted under the Alien and Sedition Acts, establishing a precedent that they were unconstitutional. Look, there's James Madison. The Sedition Act ought to produce universal alarm because it is leveled against that right of freely examining public characters and measures and of free communications among the people thereon, which has ever been justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right. Isn't that a beautiful expression, both of the importance of the right of freely examining public characters and measures, in other words, people like President Adams, and freely communicating your opinions. And that's the only effectual guardian of every other right. Why? Because unless I have the right to say, hey, President Adams, you're wrongly suppressing freedom of conscience, or your government officials are breaking into people's houses and engaging in unreasonable searches and seizures, then I won't be able to mobilize public opinion to defend all the other rights that were given by God or nature, as well as being enumerated in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So we've set up this great drama between the Alien and Sedition Acts and Jefferson and Madison's claim that they were unconstitutional. We're going to have to wait nearly 100 years until 1917 and the 1920s for the Supreme Court to be able to agree with Jefferson and Madison. And I want to tell you that story in a second. But I think before I do that, I better pause and ask if Kerry or anyone else has any questions.
Yeah, some of the questions coming in are really saying, like, where did this idea come from? How did they see it, and why? What was going on in this moment with Alien Sedition Acts that caused kind of this worry and concern with Adams, and this pushback with Jefferson? It's war. Is it political change in the government? What was kind of the genesis of it?
Well, the genesis of the Alien and Sedition Acts was, as usual, war. That tends to be the time when the government really clamps down on civil liberties. And there was a fear of war with France, and the Federalists were considered to be friends of England, and the Jeffersonians of France. And basically, the Adams administration says, we have to prevent you from criticizing us as a public safety measure. That was the justification for it. The government always insists that national security compels the abridgment of civil liberties, but the Jeffersonians would have none of it and say, hey, this is just a transparent political excuse to keep yourselves in power, to allow criticisms of our guy, Jefferson, but protect your guy, Adams, from criticism. That's going to be really central, too, for our next story, which also had to do with civil liberties in wartime.
And I just wanted to share for everybody, because I know the chat's a little insane. So guys, with the chat, please stay focused on questions around the talk. And if you have direct constitutional questions, use the Q&A. It's a little bit easier for me to see your questions. But Kavan said, freedom of speech applies to criticism of public figures of others. Freedom of speech means you can say anything you want against others as long as it doesn't incite violence. So in this time period, is that idea right?
It's
close.
it's close, but that idea, which you so well state, that freedom of speech is okay as long as it doesn't incite violence, only becomes explicit around World War I, and that's the story I'm going to tell you now about how that emerged. It was in World War I. There's another series of fears about national security. It's 1917. The government passes another Sedition Act. And once again, like the 1798 one, this act prohibits criticism of the war effort. And you see on the screen Eugene V. Debs. He was the socialist candidate for president a whole bunch of times. And he spent the 1920 campaign, when he ran for president, in a jail cell because he'd been indicted for sedition and for expressing socialist ideals. Who's expressing, who says that he's a socialist today who's running for president? Why, Bernie Sanders. Basically, Eugene V. Debs is the Bernie Sanders of 1920s, starting around 1917. And he says, hey, citizens, don't enlist in World War I. The war is the tool of capitalists and corporations run by financiers like J.P. Morgan's and is the enemy of the people. What he's saying is not that different from what Bernie Sanders might be saying today. Now, when Bernie Sanders criticizes the corporations, everyone says, of course, that's his right. It's the First Amendment. He's a candidate for president. But in 1917, that right wasn't so clearly established by the Supreme Court. So Eugene V. Debs is indicted for sedition under the Sedition Act of 1917 for impeding the war effort. And believe it or not, it's hard to believe today because we've changed so much. His conviction for sedition is upheld by the Supreme Court under a test called the bad tendency test. The idea then is that any speech that might have a bad tendency to incite people to break the law down the line can be restricted. And since some people might listen to Debs's speech and not enlist in the draft, the Supreme Court held it's okay to throw him in jail for encouraging disobedience to the draft. Now, what's so important about the cases that the Supreme Court decided around this time is they inspired dissenting opinions by two great justices, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Justice Louis Brandeis. You saw a picture of Justice Holmes because our great web editor, Scott Bomboy, is using Holmes as his avatar. So that's what Justice Holmes looks like with his mustache. But I want to tell you right now about Justice Louis Brandeis, because he wrote in a case called Whitney versus California, the Supreme Court opinion that, to answer the question, clearly said that you can only ban speech if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That's where the test came from. And Brandeis's opinion is so inspiring because it comes up with the most eloquent explanation for why we have to protect free speech since the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions themselves. Now, as a kind of party trick, I can recite, I think, we tried it last week during our beta run, a selection from Brandeis's opinion in the Whitney case. There you see Holmes is on the left with his extremely impressive white mustache, and Brandeis is on the right. Look at him looking with he had very clear gray blue eyes, and he was a great devotee of two traditions, Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence and the ancient Greeks. He thought that 5th century Athens and Pericles' funeral oration and the philosophy of Aristotle and his Socrates were among the greatest expressions of human reason. So Brandeis is writing a separate opinion disagreeing with the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the conviction of a woman who stood up in California and criticized racist lynching. That's what this woman did. Her name was Anita Whitney, and people were going around engaging in terrible terrorist violence against African Americans, including lynching them. And she stood up at a meeting of the California Communist Party, and she said, we've got to stop this lynching. Now, Anita Whitney wasn't even a member of the California Communist Party. She just attended a meeting, but she was indicted for something called criminal syndicalism, which basically means associating with groups that are considered illegal. And on the idea that her speech might be heard by someone and could lead someone in the future to join the Communist Party, which was illegal, she's indicted and she's convicted. Her conviction is upheld, and Justice Brandeis disagrees. And he writes this unbelievably beautiful concurring opinion. And I'm going to try to recite from memory the key passage, and then I'm going to ask you what you think. Listen very closely to each of Brandeis's words, because each one is important. And what's so significant is Brandeis begins by talking not about Madison and the founders of the Constitution in 1787, but of Jefferson and the revolutionaries of 1776. Here's Brandeis in Whitney. Those who won our revolution believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness, and courage to be the secret of liberty. That's a quotation from Pericles' funeral oration. They believe that liberty to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. That without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile. That with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. Wow, it's just so beautiful. I get so inspired every time I recite those gorgeous words. And let's unpack them now. We have Jefferson, who Brandeis talked about, because he talked about the revolutionaries of 1776. But the crucial idea is that as long as there's time enough for deliberation, the best response to evil counsels is good ones. The best response to hate speech is counter speech, because Brandeis has such faith in reason. And he said that they believed, the founders believed, that all of us have a duty to develop our faculties of reason so the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. Brandeis believed that what we're doing here today, talking together, reasoning together, listening to arguments on both sides of a question, is necessary for the cultivation of our faculties of reason. We can't cultivate those faculties unless we have access to all arguments, and then even the most noxious arguments, like the advocacy of communism in this case, can't be banned unless they threaten to and are likely to incite imminent violence. It's an amazing expression of faith in the power of reason and deliberation and discussion. And maybe the first question I'll ask after you've been listening to me for a while, is whether you agree with Brandeis. Do you share his faith that as long as people have access to arguments on all sides, then it's fine to allow hate speech or fake news or all sorts of noxious doctrine to be heard, because people deliberating thoughtfully have enough time to distinguish evil counsels from good ones? And do you share Brandeis's faith that reason will prevail?
So as everybody's answering that one, I wanted to share what Isabelle wrote to the panelists. She wrote that the freedom to think freely is a right and an instinct for us as humans, and speaking is merely voicing those free thoughts. As long as it won't bring harm or promote an illegal action, it is okay.
That's great. I'm getting a lot of yes, I completely agree, but I also saw that's not always the case. And it might not always be the case, especially in the age of the internet. I mean, we're spending an hour together. You've all taken the time to reason together. But think about how fast speech moves on Twitter and Facebook. When fake news travels faster and further than real news, people can get really inflamed or excited by a sensational headline and share something without reading it. And also, we know on Twitter that Twitter mobs can mobilize really fast. If someone says something unpopular, then everyone can gang up on that person and quickly dox them and do all sorts of other forms of social shaming. And there may not be enough time for a reasoned judgment to prevail. So given the speed of speech on social media, does that change your views about whether, given enough time, and deliberation can produce reason? I see fake news equals lies. Brandeis remains correct. And Kerry, what are we getting in the
So some of the comments are, many people can't tell the difference between real or fake. So that's a part that plays into this. If you don't know it's fake and it spreads, that could be a bigger problem. You can't expect all people to deliberate on an issue, and how fastly do things move. And I think, I think one of the questions around this has popped up over and over again, is where's the line around hate speech? And when I ask that question, I also want you to define for everybody, what is hate speech? And then how have the courts kind of seen this as well?
Great, crucial question. What is hate speech and how have the courts seen that as well? Well, hate speech is not a legal term. It's not a constitutional term. Hate speech could be any speech that people find hateful. And the Supreme Court confronted this question in the 1960s in a case called the Brandenburg case, Brandenburg versus Ohio. And it's an extremely dramatic, jarring, and maybe even shocking case because it involved the Ku Klux Klan. There you see Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969. Do you see those people? They're wearing Ku Klux Klan uniforms. And that's what was going on in this case. The Klan is holding a rally in Ohio. A bunch of people are gathering in those uniforms, which themselves are expressions of racist hate. And a Klan member stands up at this rally and says, remember, this is the height of the civil rights movement when equality is spreading throughout the land. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 has guaranteed equal rights for all. Martin Luther King has given his immortal speech on the Washington Mall promising the resurrection of Jefferson's promise of that all men are created equal when he says that he has a dream, and there is a challenge to racist violence and inequality. And the Klan reacts by saying, we've got to stop this spread of equality. And this Klan member stands up at the rally and says, unless something changes in this country, then white people are going to seek revengeance. Sounds pretty threatening, doesn't it? I mean, he's threatening revenge or revengeance, and he's doing that at a Klan rally surrounded by people in those hateful uniforms. Well, he's prosecuted under an Ohio law that bans a form of hate speech. I don't have in front of me the exact words that the Ohio law used. I could find them, but instead of doing that, we'll take that as an example of a law that bans speech that expresses hate or contempt toward a particular group. That would be one definition of hate speech. And he challenges his conviction, saying it violates the First Amendment. And in this really important Supreme Court opinion, the court agrees with him that his speech is protected by the First Amendment. Why? Because the court channels Justice Brandeis and says that the speech, although hateful, although deeply distasteful, although racist, was not intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. It was a hateful expression of political views, but it was not likely to incite imminent violence, nor was it intended to do so. You know, that was kind of a debatable call there. Here's this bunch of people in Klan uniforms. You might think they'd take their pitchforks or whatever awful thing that guy in front is holding and go actually commit some violence or burn crosses on people's lawns, which Klan members did in future cases. And the Supreme Court there, in the closer to our own time, just a decade or so ago, held that it is permissible to ban burning a cross on someone's front lawn because that's really an express threat. It's an actual threat of violence. It's not just a symbolic claim that unless this happens, then we might take revenge, but it's a statement, I hate you and I'm gonna burn your house down right now. So that was the way the court dealt with its first significant confrontation with hate speech. It said, unless the speech is intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, then it's protected, even if it's hateful. And although speech can be restricted in its time, place, and manner, you can have rules for protests. The Klan rally could be required to be held in a particular place at a particular time rather than right on someone's front lawn. The speech itself had to be protected because it wasn't intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. But let me pause there. Do you think the Brandenburg decision was correct, or did it go too far?
And Jeff, I want to add in a couple things that I'm seeing on the side is, and you're getting, I agree, I disagree. One of the teachers pointed out that the students on here need to give evidence as they give this, just like you're giving evidence by citing court cases, and I'm trying to copy and paste them into the side. But again, I will give you guys the full list after this. So I love the teachers for saying, give your evidence. But again, I think some of the answers are coming from the difference between people's constitutional question and maybe their personal political question. So the question is, can the government restrict this speech? May it restrict the speech which what's in the Constitution and how the courts have interpreted it, or what you believe it should be? So you might want to just hit that for one beat, just so we can understand why you could have mixed opinions in your own mind.
Absolutely, and mixed opinions or finding a conflict between your political and constitutional views, far from being troubling is the most elevated thing that you can achieve as a citizen, because it shows that you're doing what your teachers suggest you should do, is consider the evidence rather than being guided by your passions. I can't imagine that very many people in this chat, in this class, in our convening together, would approve of the speech in Brandenburg. I hope they're not, people who are sympathetic to the Klan here, because that speech is hateful and it's disgraceful and violates the dignity of those human beings who are being degraded. But the fact that we despise this speech, the fact that this is the thought we hate, doesn't mean that the government may restrict it. That's how vigorous our faith in the power of reason is, that even the thought we hate may be protected by the First Amendment. So that's why separating your political from your constitutional views is a sign that you're being extraordinarily principled. You're transcending your partisan passions. I want you to do that now, friends. Allow all of those passions, all that partisanship, all of those impulsive views to leave your mind. Just expel them from yourself and repose in the cool voice of reason, and sit with your reason for a moment, and then ask yourself that question. Say, of course I hate that speech. It's degrading and disgraceful, but am I so committed to the principles of the First Amendment that I will not only defend but march to prohibit the government from restricting speech unless it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence? What an extraordinary expression of faith and reason. It's extraordinarily inspiring. And maybe this is the time, as you think, I know I'm asking you to do a lot. It's very hard to separate your political from your constitutional views. I think I should now share with you the beautiful words of Justice Holmes, who also insisted on the protection of hate speech, but for slightly different reasons than Justice Brandeis. Justice Brandeis had tremendous faith in the power of reasoned deliberation to lead to the truth. He thought if we took enough time to listen respectfully to each other, to consider our evidence, then we could converge in common on a truth that we could not know alone. Holmes was more focused on the importance of a deregulated marketplace of ideas. Holmes was served in the Civil War. He was almost killed 3 times. He was wounded 3 times in the Civil War, including at the Battle of Antietam, where 23,000 Americans died or wounded, the bloodiest day in American history. And this war was so traumatic to Holmes that he lost his faith in ideals of any kind. He wasn't especially optimistic that deliberating could lead to a kind of truth, but he did think that unless the marketplace of ideas was completely unregulated and people could express their hateful views through speech, he thought open violence would result. He thought speech was necessary to both create a safety valve, and also that in a democracy, a majority had to be able to have its will in order to prevent violence. So this is Holmes in the Abrams case. It's a beautiful case. I'm just typing because I don't have it right here unless Kerry has it right there. And here we go. And you can get all of these cases so quickly here. And the beautiful speech here is here we go. Oh, this is so, these words, I can't do this one from memory, but thank you for listening to it because it's another example of constitutional poetry. This is Holmes in Abrams. Persecution for the expression of opinions seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises or your power and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they come to believe, even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which our wishes safely can be carried out. also very beautiful and stirring words, and the key phrases there are that the ultimate good is better reached through free trade in ideas, and the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. It's a very, it's a sort of free enterprise vision of free speech. Holmes isn't necessarily confident that truth, the ultimate sublime truth will prevail, but he has great intellectual humility. He has no confidence that his idea of what's true is more valid than anyone else's. He thinks that you have to test your ideas in the competition of the market, and whatever emerges from that competition has to be accepted from as truth.
So Jeff, on that point, good question came in from the chat. Does the marketplace of ideas still function in the 21st century with some censorship on speech, but just in general, how social media platforms work and the increased use of social media? Great question, right?
Great question. We've got to focus on that. We're engaging in the glories of the platforms by talking to each other virtually, but we also know that the platforms bring an explosion of fake news, of hate speech, of falsehoods, of bullying, of all sorts of really troubling speech that is spread on a scale that Holmes couldn't have imagined. Holmes is talking about people standing on a soapbox and criticizing the war. Here we're talking about a billion pieces of content being exchanged on Facebook every hour or every day or whatever it is. It's just growing exponentially. So is this marketplace of ideas still functioning? Well, when you ask about the platforms and free speech, I'm going to ask you a very basic question too. Could Facebook ban a video of someone burning the American flag? Or could Google owns YouTube? Could Google say you can't post videos on Google of people burning the flag? Yes, yes, yes. Well, they do. Facebook has the right. Yes, yes, absolutely. Facebook is private. Absolutely. Google is private. Yes, it is. You've understood the central difference between Google and the government. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. It does not say Google or Mark Zuckerberg shall make no law. And therefore, as a private company, Facebook and Google do have the power to ban hate speech, which would be absolutely protected by the First Amendment. And in fact, they do ban hate speech. If you go to the Facebook terms of service and the Google terms of service, you'll see that both of the platforms, like Twitter, prohibit hate speech, which they define in different ways, and the language is important. But essentially, on Facebook and Google, for example, if you can't demean a group on the basis of race or religion, you can criticize a religious leader, but you cannot hatefully criticize a religious group. So on Facebook and Google, you can't say, I hate Muslims or Jews or Christians, but you can say, down with the Prophet Muhammad or our Lord Jesus or with Moses. So that's just a distinction that Facebook and Google have come up with on their own. It's not rooted in the First Amendment. It's not rooted in American constitutional history, but as a private company, Facebook and Google are free to make whatever decisions they please. Now, in making those decisions, Facebook and Google are striking a line closer to what European governments are doing. I began by saying America is the most protective country for speech in the world. If we were in Europe, there'd be no question of the government's ability to ban hate speech. In fact, if we were in Europe right now and one of you started chatting, Jeff is really boring, this isn't as good a First Amendment class as I expected, down with Jeff, I could sue Google afterward to remove your chat if it were archived, and if it was on Twitter, it would be, on the grounds that this insulted my dignity. And under a new right that the European Court of Justice has just recognized called the right to be forgotten, which is an amazing right. It comes from the French droit à l'oubli, or the right of oblivion, which is very French. It's right out of Jean-Paul Sartre. I want to be forgotten rather than I want to be remembered, like Americans tend to think. But basically, Google would then have to make a decision about whether I'm a public figure and whether your tweet or chat or text is in the public interest. And if they decide that it's can stay up and then a privacy commissioner overrules them and decides that it actually offended my dignity, I'm not a public figure, Google is liable for up to 2% of its annual income, which last year was, I don't know, $80 billion or something like that. So fines like that concentrate the minds, and as a result, Google has removed 43% of the requests it's gotten to take down truthful but embarrassing or hateful speech about people that it's received, including requests to take down articles about the right to be forgotten itself. So you see, friends, what's so important about what we're discussing. What America does is something that no other European country does. It's something that Google and Facebook don't do. It's just something that a right that our founders believed we have from God or nature that our government is prohibited from infringing. And now I guess I'll ask you, Kerry, what are our friends' reactions to that? And would you prefer to live in a world that looks more like Europe than America?
Well, I think that's a great question, is where do they strike the balance? But I also think some of the things that are coming up around here is a couple comments on the side about Facebook and Google is, are they removing things in a biased way? So again, freedom of speech is about what the government can remove. But then the secondary question was, oh, because if they can remove it, then are they doing it in a biased way? And I think the two are connected, because when the government says what has a tendency to say, we will not engage in this unless it's likely to intended causing imminent violence. So they don't make the opinion of what's good speech or bad speech. And that always brings me back to your favorite guy and what he said about what's the answer to speech.
Exactly. Counter speech, more speech, says Brandeis. And that question of bias is central, because that's always the fear. That goes back to the Alien and Sedition Act. Don't trust the government. That's what we learned at the time of the founding. You trust the government to pass a sedition law, they're going to forbid criticism of President Adams, but allow criticism of his political rival, Thomas Jefferson. So should we trust Mark Zuckerberg to be unbiased? That was the big question when some conservative groups a while ago claimed that their speech was being removed in ways that of liberal speaking groups was not. Mark Zuckerberg disagreed and tried to give evidence that he was being even-handed. But generally, we do not trust the government or the deciders of our free speech world to make content-based discriminations. And that leads us back to the interactive Constitution. If we go to the interactive Constitution, we'll see a great essay by our two scholars, Jeff Stone and Eugene Volokh, who are leading liberal and conservative scholars. And they were asked to come up with 1,000 words about what the First Amendment means. And because they signed this together, you can be confident that every word in this statement is accepted by both sides. And they note that the Supreme Court has held that restrictions on speech because of its content, that is, when the government targets the speaker's message, generally violates the First Amendment. Laws that prohibit people from criticizing a war, opposing abortion, or advocating high taxes are examples of content-based restrictions. These laws are especially problematic because they distort public debate and contradict a basic principle of self-governance, that the government cannot be trusted to decide what ideas or information that people should be allowed to hear. So that's the central idea of the First Amendment, that the government's not in the business of making biased or content-based discrimination and decisions. But our scholars, Volokh and Stone, go on to identify three, or I should say a series of categories where the Supreme Court has held that certain types of speech are considered low value and therefore can be restricted under a less demeaning standard. I'll just share them really fast so we can put them on the table. And then...
We have lots of questions if you're ready for the speed round.
Okay. Well, sure. I'll just quickly say the low value categories are defamation, statements that damage a person's reputation, true threats, I'll kill you if you don't give me your money, fighting words, speech that's likely to lead to imminent violence, obscenity, child pornography, and commercial advertising. Those are the only big exceptions. Short of that, you cannot make content-based decisions. Okay, speed round.
Good job, because the speed round was also about fighting words. Somebody in the Q&A asked about fighting words, so there you go. This happened multiple times now. There's a couple questions going around about the national parks being closed, and so the national parks being closed, as well as outdoor areas where people peacefully assemble, and the limit being no more than 10. Does that in some way violate the First Amendment, or does that fall under threat to public safety? This was Johnny Walsh.
Great question, Johnny. We did a great podcast last week. Every week I do a podcast called We the People that I'd love you to check out. I call up a liberal and conservative scholar. Last week it was quarantines and the Constitution. And I asked our scholars, two public health experts, the same question you did. What are the limits on the government's ability to close public spaces and stop people from assembling? And you know what I learned? Very few limits. That basically throughout American history, both the state governments, who are primarily responsible for implementing quarantines, as we've seen, it's kind of state by state, New York, California, New Jersey, and so forth, have had very broad power under public health rationales to restrict public gatherings, and the federal government, too, has similarly broad power. I pressed our scholars, they couldn't come up with any limitations except for possibly the federal government exercising powers might have some limitations because its power comes from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And also, this was really interesting, although Congress would have really broad power to restrict public gatherings under the Public Welfare Clause of Article 1. I think you can check that one out after we talk. The president on his own only has delegated power. So if he's issuing an executive order saying no gatherings of more than 10 people, he'd have to be able to point to some other law that Congress had passed that gave him that power, and that authority might be challenged. But the short answer, and there's a lot more to say, check out the podcast for the really fascinating history, is if you can invoke a legitimate public health emergency, then states and the feds have broad power to restrict public movements. And if you want a good Supreme Court case to check out on that question, there's a case called Jacobson, upholding Massachusetts its power to mandate vaccinations in the face of a public health emergency.
And there was a question around that same thing about habeas corpus. Could they suspend habeas corpus? And have a president done that ever before?
Presidents sure have done it before. The Constitution says Congress has the power to suspend habeas corpus in times of emergency, but during the Civil War, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus on his own at a time when Congress was out of session because he said, shall all the laws but one go unexecuted? In other words, in the name of protecting Congress's right to suspend, does that mean the whole nation has to fall to pieces? Now, later, Lincoln called Congress back into session and Congress retrospectively ratified his act. That case has come to stand for the proposition that in the time of genuine emergency, when there's no opportunity to summon Congress, then the president may be able to suspend habeas corpus when he deems that a national emergency demands it. There's a really interesting blog post by a scholar called Michael Dorff arguing that the president could today on his own claim that a national emergency allows him to suspend habeas corpus without congressional approval. That's a controversial claim though, friends, and that's one of those questions about which there are good arguments on both sides.
Yeah, and so a couple other questions were around how do these freedom of speech play into effect when we're talking about the elections? So one of our first questions in from Nancy was, how did Citizens United determine the money in speech? So our next big topic in the Constitution, elections. So wanted to throw that one at you as we have 3 minutes to wrap up.
You know what? That's such a big and great question, Nancy. I think why don't we, I'm going to give you some homework back. That's what is always a good way to delay a really big discussion. Read Citizens United. See why it was that Justice Anthony Kennedy held that money is a form of speech because people need money in order to disseminate their speech, and why the dissenting opinion by Justice John Paul Stevens completely disagreed and said that there's a long history of the speech of corporations and also of unions being treated differently than that of natural persons, because natural persons have rights of conscience that come from God or nature, not from government, but corporations don't, according to Justice Stevens. There was a very vigorous disagreement on that question. And if you can read the majority opinion and the dissent, then you can make up your own mind. Maybe I'll use that as an opportunity Kerry, do you want to say one
Yeah, I
last
was going to say, I think that is a perfect question we could lead with on Friday at 1 o'clock when we do the Ask Jeff session, and get those general questions. So just as you guys all know that tomorrow we're going to repeat this same conversation at 1 o'clock around free speech, but this Friday, March 27th at 1 p.m., we're going to do an Ask Jeff session. So I'm going to pull some of the questions that weren't answered today and be able to feed Jeff those questions on Friday. But also, as we wrap this up, Jeff, I really, it's always good to start with that original constitutional question. When can and when cannot the government limit speech?
Absolutely. And I'm so energized by our great conversation. So looking forward to continuing it tomorrow when we can really delve into the question of students like you. Do you have the same rights as adults? And can school principals restrict your free speech rights, like banning a Confederate flag on a knapsack, which is a question that lower courts are divided on? If you want to prepare for tomorrow, try to check out the lower court case that's on the question and read the majority opinion and read the dissent, and then we can convene and tell me what you think. Your homework in this enterprise together, I hope will be well unpleasant, because it's an opportunity to expand our minds. And that's to read the original decisions. I know you're not law students. Some of you are in high school and college. We even have some middle school students with us. But I have faith in you. I know that if you take the time to read the majority opinions as well as the concurrences and the dissents, you can discern the essential principles. You don't have to read every word. Don't get distracted by the legal technicalities. But you can feel and discern and be inspired by these basic principles that we're describing, like speech can only be banned if it's intended to cause imminent violence, and that we must protect the thought we hate. You can do it. Read the majority, read the dissent, separate your political from your constitutional views, and make up your own mind. It's such a glorious privilege and a duty that we have as citizens. And I'm going to close with the words of Justice Brandeis. He said, public discussion is a political duty. And then he always said, if we must let our minds be governed by reason, we must let our minds be bold. Thank you so much, friends, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 1.
Thank you all very much. And I will be emailing you a list of resources. We'll see you tomorrow, Friday at 1 o'clock. I know the chat was lively today, so we'll get a better grip on it for Thursday. But thank you all very much. And it's great to have you all on. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Recording has stopped.
Great.
I'm going to just write down some of these questions that were in the chat box that we didn't get to as everybody starts to log off. And then Jeff, just do you mind a call in like 5 minutes?
That would be great. I appreciate you too, Wellesley. Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Farewell. Make sure we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, Danny, James, Joan. Hi. Bye, Renee. Thank you. Will tomorrow's session be different? Yes, it will be. Bye. Thank you, Marielle.
I learned a lot. Yay, Dustin.
I did too.
I know, right?
Yes, good, Aaron. It would be great if you're a constitutional lawyer. You can do it. Follow your passion, keep reading, and you can achieve your dreams.
Scott, that is okay. Your kids will speak up next time.
Thank you, Mike. Come back tomorrow.
Bye, Robert, Morris. You were a great chatter. Okay.
Excellent.
I'm going to stop the